While working the night shift in the emergency room of a hospital in California, a new emergency case was rushed in on a stretcher, the wheels rattling across the floor and the smell of disinfectant filling the hallway. Holding the patient file in my hand, I looked down at the information on the first page. My mind went blank for a few seconds, and then my heart started beating very fast. I never thought I would see my family again this way. My name is Lena Carter, and since I was little, I was used to feeling unimportant in my own home. Before I continue, I want to know where you are listening to this story from, who you are with, and what time it is where you are. That helps me know that someone is walking alongside me. Now listen as I go on. There are 4 people in my family, but everything has always revolved around my brother. He liked sports and was always praised, even though his grades were average. I studied well, but it was treated as nothing special. My birthdays often passed quickly because they fell on the same day as his tournaments. My parents went to the stadium early and forgot my birthday cake. I remember once I got the highest score in biology and brought the certificate home. My mother just said, "Put it there," and went to cook. My father sat watching television and did not look up. I stood in the living room for a long time and wondered if I even existed. From those days, I learned to be quiet and take care of myself. I did not complain because I knew no one would listen. The dream of becoming a doctor came to me by chance when a classmate fainted during gym, and I was the closest one. I kept her still and called the teachers. That day, the nurse said, I was calm and did the right thing. That sentence made me happy all day. It was the first time I felt useful. From then on, I decided to study medicine even though no one at home believed I could do it. I studied all day and worked weekends to save money. When I received the scholarship letter, I read it again and again to make sure I was not dreaming. I brought the letter home and placed it on the dining table. My parents just nodded, and my brother laughed and said, "Do you think you are so special?" I did not answer, but I felt very sad inside. From that day, he started asking me more about the scholarship money and school. I thought he cared, so I told him everything. I did not know that was the biggest mistake of my life. The day I left home for the city to enroll, it rained heavily. I packed my clothes into a suitcase and looked at my small room one last time. My mother told me to remember to call home, and my father did not come out to see me off because he said he was busy. My brother stood at the door and looked at me with a strange expression. I still believed that if I studied well and succeeded, my family would change the way they saw me. The first years of college were very hard. I studied and worked at a cafe. There were nights I fell asleep at my desk from exhaustion. I called home less because each call was only a few short sentences, and then silence. The distance slowly became normal, until a close friend of mine had a serious traffic accident and had to stay in the hospital for a long time. I requested a leave of absence for 1 semester to care for her because she had no one beside her. I told my brother and asked him to tell my parents for me. I trusted him because he was the only one in the family who still talked to me. While I was at the hospital, everything at home began to change without me knowing. My calls were no longer answered and my messages were not read. At first I thought my parents were angry because I temporarily stopped school. I planned to go home to explain, but was afraid they did not want to see me. Months later, I learned that my family had heard a completely different story about me. They believed I dropped out because I was out of control and involved with drugs. That story did not come from outsiders, but from my own brother. When I returned to school and continued my studies, back in my hometown, they already saw me as a failed child. I did not know that until years later, and now standing in the emergency room looking at a patient file with the same last name as mine, I felt everything return to the beginning. The ceiling lights were very bright, and the heart monitor beeped steadily beside me. I took a deep breath, not knowing that my life was about to face the lie that had buried me for many years. The days staying at the hospital caring for my friend passed quickly and were exhausting. I slept on a plastic chair in the hallway, washed my face with cold water in the public restroom in the morning, and bought bread from a vending machine. I did not feel like I was sacrificing anything great. I simply thought that if our positions were reversed, I would hope someone would stay with me. I still called home every night just to say I was fine and would return to school in a few months. I believed my parents would understand because I had never caused trouble before. What I did not know was that while I sat by my friend's hospital bed, my brother was building a completely different story at home. He told my parents I did not drop out to care for a friend, but because I met a bad group in the city. He said I often asked for money but did not say what I used it for. He printed a few photos of me with classmates and gave them strange names and said they were my drug-addicted boyfriend. To make the story look more real, he created a fake email with the name of my university and sent it to my parents saying I had been suspended for violating regulations. He left the computer open on the table and told my mother to read it herself. My mother was not familiar with technology, so she believed it immediately because everything looked real. The signature looked the same. The logo looked the same. The writing sounded like previous letters from the school. From that day, my family's attitude toward me changed completely without me knowing. One afternoon, while I was buying coffee, my phone vibrated and my father's name appeared. I answered in a normal voice, but the other end was cold. My father asked where I was and what I was doing. I said I was at the hospital caring for my friend and would return to school soon. My father was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Stop lying." He said, "I made the family lose face," and he did not want to hear any more explanations. I asked what he was talking about, but he only said he knew everything and hung up. I stood in the hallway, not understanding what I had done wrong. A few hours later, my mother called, her voice trembling and crying. She asked if I was using drugs and if I was with bad people. I panicked and said no. I said I was really at the hospital and could send pictures to prove it. My mother said my brother had already sent her evidence and she did not know who to believe. I asked what evidence, and she said the letter from the school and the messages I had sent asking for money. I tried to explain. I asked for money to pay rent and buy books, but my mother only said she needed time to think. From that day, when I called my brother, he never answered. I texted asking what he told our parents, but there was no reply. A few days later, I realized I had been blocked on social media by my whole family. Relatives began to avoid me. No one asked what happened. A few sent short messages asking how I was and then went silent after I replied. I could not understand how everything changed so fast. While I was still confused, my friend became critical. The doctor said her family was far away and had not arrived. I was the one who signed the final consent for surgery, but she did not survive. That night, I sat alone outside the emergency room until late, with no one to call. I texted my mother that my friend had died, but the message only showed sent with no reply. The funeral was simple, and I was the only one standing beside the coffin. I looked at my phone many times, hoping for a call from home, but there was none. A few days later, I received a message from my father, with only one sentence, "Do not come back." I read it again and again without understanding why I was expelled from my home in just a few weeks. I moved into a cheap room near school. At night, I worked at a diner, and during the day, tried to return to class as if nothing had happened. I did not tell anyone because I did not know where to begin. I only knew that from that moment I had no family to return to. Every time I looked at my phone, I still hoped someone would ask if I was okay, but the screen was always silent. I began to understand my brother had not lied once but had built an entirely different image of me in everyone's eyes. An image I could not reach to correct. I did not know why he did it, but I knew he did not want me to return to my path of education. He wanted me to disappear from the family's life as if I had never existed. In the small rented room with one table and an old bed, I opened my computer and looked at my academic record. Each grade appeared clearly, and I wondered if I had the strength to continue without anyone behind me. I did not cry. I just felt empty and tired. I realized from that moment my life had turned in another direction. No parents, no brother, no place to return to. Only me and the path I had to walk alone, and I did not know that the decision to quietly return to school that day would lead me to a future my family who once abandoned me would have to face. I returned to school after my friend's funeral without telling anyone and leaving no trace for my family. I filled out the leave paperwork myself, signed my name on the confirmation lines, and heard the administrative staff say I could continue, as if I had never disappeared. Everything was so normal, it almost felt absurd, because my life outside had collapsed, while in this school no one cared. I moved into a small room near campus. Thin walls. At night I could clearly hear cars passing and people arguing outside. Inside, there was only an old bed, a study desk, and a dim yellow light. I began working more shifts. Evening at the diner, morning at the library, sometimes cleaning labs for a few extra dollars. I was tired but did not feel pitiful. I just thought if I stopped, there would be nothing left. No family, no friends, no one to help me stand again. At school, some noticed I had taken a break and looked at me with curiosity. Others asked directly why I had disappeared so long. I only said I had personal matters to resolve. I did not say more and did not want pity. One professor called me in because he saw the gap in my transcript. He asked if I was sure I could focus enough to keep up. I nodded and said this was the only thing I had left to do. He did not ask further, but from that day paid more attention to me. I studied intensely, not out of ambition, but because I had nowhere to hide. Every night I stayed in the library until closing and walked back to my room in the cold wind. Sometimes I wanted to call someone just to hear a familiar voice, but I had no number left to dial. I was used to holding everything inside and waking up on time the next morning. During a hospital internship, I met an older patient having a heart attack and he was terrified. I just stood beside him, holding his hand, and told him I was here. He looked at me and said thank you in a very small voice. In that moment, I realized I still had feelings, and I could still be with someone even when no one was with me. Moments like that helped me keep going. I started being given more responsibilities during my rotations, and my supervising doctor praised me for working carefully. It was the first time in a long time I was recognized without having to explain who I was or where I came from. There was a new classmate who often sat next to me in the library. We did not talk much, just sometimes asked to borrow a pen or swap shifts. That person knew I lived alone and did not bring up family. That made me feel comfortable. I did not need anyone digging into my past. I just needed peace. Sometimes I heard news about my family through other people, that my parents still lived in the old house and my brother still had the same familiar job. That information reached me lightly and faded quickly. I did not feel angry, only distant, like hearing about another family that had nothing to do with me. Graduation came quickly, and I stood in the auditorium in a gown that was a little too big on me. Around me were other people's families, laughing and taking photos. I stood alone in a corner and asked a stranger to take one picture for me as a memory. I emailed that photo to myself and did not send it to anyone else. When the ceremony ended, I carried my bag out with no one waiting, no flowers, no congratulations, but I did not feel as empty as I once thought I would. I was used to walking alone and taking responsibility for every choice I made. On the way home, I stopped to buy a hot coffee and sat watching people pass by. I thought about the past few years and realized I no longer waited for my family to understand me or come back for me. I only needed to know I did not quit, and I still kept the person I wanted to become. I understood that some relationships break not because I was not good enough, but because someone else chose not to see me, and from that moment I accepted that my life would be built from what I made with my own hands, not from what I once lost. I did not know what the future would be, but I knew I had passed the most painful stage in silence, and that silence taught me how to stand steady without anyone holding my hand. I walked into my new shift with shoes still wet from the rain, and the familiar disinfectant smell clinging to the hallway. The nurse called my name to receive the chart. I nodded and moved quickly toward the emergency area. A stretcher was pushed in with the wheels scraping hard against the floor. The man on it was breathing fast, and his hand curled from pain. The attending doctor told me to check heart rate and blood pressure. I placed the stethoscope on the patient's chest and heard irregular sounds. The monitor beside him flashed continuously. I signaled the nurse to prepare medication and call for more support. While waiting for lab results, I held the medical chart and read each line. When I saw the patient's name, I froze for a very brief beat. It was not an unfamiliar name, and it was not a name I ever wanted to see here. I looked up at the face, struggling to breathe on the bed, and I recognized clearly the man who once told me not to come back. His hair was much grayer and his face thinner, but when his eyes opened, they were still the same as before. I did not call him by any word at all. I only stated the condition and kept directing the nurse to recheck the numbers. No one in the room knew the relationship between me and that man. They only saw a young doctor moving fast and showing no emotion. I ordered the patient taken for cardiac imaging and prepared for surgery. My mother appeared at the waiting room door with a tired posture and red eyes. She stared at me for a long time before she finally said my name, but I did not answer as a daughter. I only said I was the doctor in charge of this case, and I needed her to sign the surgical consent. She held the pen with both hands, shaking, and asked if it was really me. I did not answer that question. I only pointed to the line that needed a signature. She lowered her head and signed in silence. I turned away the moment the paper came back and walked into the operating room. The white lights over the table made everything painfully clear. The heart monitor sounded steady, and every person on the team stood exactly where they were supposed to. I gave the order to start, and my hands moved on the routine I had learned over so many years. I did not think about any sentence from the past. I only watched the screen and listened to the patient's heartbeat. Sweat ran down my forehead, but I did not stop. The surgery lasted longer than expected because the heart was unstable. I requested more medication and adjusted the rhythm again and again. The whole time I spoke in short, clear commands for everyone to follow. No one asked about my connection to the patient, and I did not allow myself to think about it. When the rhythm on the monitor finally settled, I let out a long breath. I checked every number again, and only then allowed the procedure to end. When I removed my gloves, I felt my hands tremble from exhaustion, but my mind was sharply awake. I walked out to the waiting area, still smelling like medication, and saw my mother curled on a chair. She jumped up when she saw me and asked about him. I said the surgery was successful, and he needed close monitoring. She cried on the spot and kept saying thank you. I stood still and did not step closer. I only reminded her of visiting hours and what to watch for after surgery. There was no hug, and there were no questions about the years in between. I went back to the on-call room and wrote the case report like any other. Each line on the computer looked ordinary, but my mind felt blank. I heard nurses' footsteps in the hallway and the internal phone ringing nonstop. I answered every call and handled every small task. Only when night fell did I sit down and look out the hospital window, where streetlights reflected on the glass. I did not feel relieved, and I did not feel pain. I only felt clearly that my life would not be quiet anymore. I knew my family would try to talk to me, and I also knew I was no longer someone who could run like before. I had stood in an operating room and faced the person who once turned away from me. I had saved him with my own hands and demanded no apology. That made me understand I was standing in a different place than before. Not in the house, but in the middle of a hospital. Not as a child, but as a doctor. And from this moment, every meeting after this would no longer be a simple coincidence. It would be a real confrontation between people who once chose to walk away from each other. The next morning, I returned to the hospital before the sky was fully light and the hallway still carried the disinfectant smell from the night before. I opened the chart and checked the vital signs again and went straight to the ICU. My father lay there with a breathing tube and an IV line across his arm. The heart monitor showed a steadier rhythm than last night. I signaled the nurse to adjust the drip rate and noted every small change. Before I could leave, the door slammed open and my brother walked in with his coat unbuttoned and his face rigid. He looked me up and down and said in a low, harsh voice that I finally decided to show up. I did not answer. I only pulled the curtain to block some of the light and checked the heart monitor. He stepped closer and stood between me and the bed. I told him to move back so I could work, but he did not move. He said I disappeared for years and now I came back right when Dad was about to die, to play the hero. I set my pen down and looked straight at him and said, this was the ICU and he needed to stay quiet. He sneered and said I was still used to giving orders like when I was at home. I did not respond and walked around him to adjust the patient's position. He reached out and tugged lightly at the IV line, and I had to steady it immediately. I told him to let go and called the nurse for assistance. He pulled his hand back but stayed close to the bed and said, Dad ended up like this because I left. That if I had stayed home, none of this would have happened. I kept writing without looking at him. He raised his voice and retold old events in a way that was nothing like the truth. That I was selfish. That I only cared about myself and never thought about the family. I set the chart down and told him to step outside to talk. He refused and slammed his hand on the bed rail and the heart monitor let out a long tone. The nurse rushed in and told him to keep it down. He turned and yelled at her and then pointed at me and said I was the cause of all the trouble. I asked security to come and had them escort him out. When security arrived, he was still shouting and grabbed my arm to make me listen. I pulled my arm free and said I was doing my job as a doctor, not here to argue. He was taken into the hallway but kept shouting that I had no right to stand here. I went back to the bed and checked every connection and told the nurse to watch the heart rhythm closely. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw him leaning against the wall, staring at me with an angry look. My mother hurried down the hall and asked what happened. He immediately said I was cold, and did not even ask about Dad. My mother looked at me, waiting for an answer, but I only said the patient was stable and needed rest. He cut in and said I was pretending to be professional to hide the fact I abandoned the family. I looked at the time and said I had another case to handle. He stepped in front of me and said I was not allowed to leave until I apologized. I told him to move and reminded him this was a hospital. He gave a thin smile and said, I always hid behind work to avoid the truth. I stepped aside and called the charge nurse to arrange coverage for the patient. He hit the wall and called me a coward. I did not stop. I walked straight to the staff room. On the way, I heard him still yelling at my mother, saying I embarrassed the family. I sat at the desk and opened the computer to write the case report. Each line appeared steady, but in my ears I still heard his voice. A nurse brought coffee and asked if I was okay. I nodded and kept entering the data. Less than 10 minutes later, the staff room door opened again, and he stood there with his face red with anger. He said I could not avoid him forever, and started listing old accusations, that I left and made him carry all the responsibility, that I never sent money or checked in. I looked up and said he was old enough to take responsibility for his own life. He went quiet for a second, then laughed loudly and said, I always thought I was right. I stood and said if he kept causing a disturbance I would call security again. He stepped close to the desk and said I should not use the hospital as a shield. I pointed to the door and said he should leave. My mother appeared behind him and grabbed his arm, but he shoved her off and said she always defended me. I turned to my mother and told her she should let the patient rest. He shouted that I had no right to decide anything in this family. I said here I had the right to decide, because I was the attending doctor. He stood still for a few seconds, and then walked away. I sat back down and the room felt much quieter. I looked out the window where sunlight was starting to reach the hallway, and told myself these confrontations would continue. I returned to the room to check again, and my father was still asleep. My mother sat in the chair and said nothing. I adjusted the blanket and gave a few care instructions, and walked out. No one called me by a warm name, and I did not call anyone by a family title. I moved quickly toward the stairwell and went down to keep working. In my mind, there was only the long hallway and the sound of my own footsteps. I understood my brother had not changed, and had no intention of understanding me. And from now on, every time we met, it would not be silence anymore. It would be direct collisions. I was not afraid. I only felt I was ready to stand in my place, inside the hospital, inside my work, and inside a family I no longer wanted to return to the way I once did. A nurse called to me from the end of the hallway and said the ICU patient was awake. I nodded and grabbed the chart and walked fast toward the room, my shoes echoing on the cold tile, and the morning air still holding the metallic smell of medical tools and the stale coffee drifting from the staff room. I paused at the door for a brief beat to reread the numbers on the electronic board, and then pushed the door open. My father opened his eyes at the sound and stared at me without blinking. His gaze was no longer as hard as yesterday. It carried exhaustion and confusion. I stepped closer to the bed and checked the heart monitor and adjusted the IV line. The room was so quiet I could hear his breathing and the sound of my pen touching paper. He spoke in a rough voice and asked if it was you, my child. I did not answer directly. I said his heart was stable, but he still needed a few more days of monitoring. He turned his face toward the window and gave a very small smile, and said he did not think he would see me again dressed like this. I pulled the curtain to soften the light and asked him to move his hand so I could check his reflexes. He followed slowly and winced in pain. I wrote down the numbers and told him to breathe evenly. He asked where your mother is and where your brother is. I said they were outside and would come in after he rested. He was quiet for a moment, and then said, these past years he always thought I had forgotten home. That sentence slowed my hand for one beat, but I kept adjusting the line and watching the monitor. He said, I am sorry, very softly, like he was afraid of breaking the air in the room. I heard every word clearly, but my throat went dry, and I only said he needed to save his strength. He tried to turn his head toward me and reached his hand out. The hand was thin and trembling. I stepped back half a step and kept writing in the chart. He pulled his hand back and stared at the ceiling. I called the nurse in to change the fluid bag and told her to watch his blood pressure closely. Then I stood at the foot of the bed observing. He said, If you had come home, maybe everything would have been different. I said home is the hospital now, and my on-call room. He turned and looked at me longer, and asked if I was still angry with him. I did not answer right away. I looked at the heartbeat on the screen and then said I was doing my duty. He closed his eyes like he was thinking of something far away. I walked toward the door, but he called my name again. Weak and slow, I stopped and turned back. He said he was old and afraid of dying alone. That sentence held me still for a few seconds, and something in my chest rose hard like a wave. I did not step closer, but I did not turn away either. I told him he would not die today, and he needed to cooperate with treatment. He asked if I could stay a little longer. I looked at the clock and said I still had my shift, but I would come back to check on him. He nodded and gripped the blanket tightly. I stepped into the hallway and saw my mother leaning against the wall with her hands clasped together. She asked about his condition, and I said he was stable. She asked if he mentioned me, and I did not answer that. I only said she should let him rest. She looked at me for a long time and said I had changed a lot. I did not know changed in what way, and I did not ask. I went back to the staff room and sat down. The sound of carts rolling past and the internal paging kept repeating. I opened the computer to enter the report, but my hand still trembled a little. In my mind, I saw my father's hand reaching out and then pulling back. I took a deep breath and stood up to check the room again. He was still lying there, with his eyes closed. I adjusted the blanket and told the nurse to watch the numbers. When I walked out, I felt my chest was no longer tight the way it was before. It felt heavy and warm at the same time. I realized I no longer wanted to run from his words, but I also could not go back to the way things were. I could only stand in the middle, close enough to do my responsibility, far enough not to be dragged back into those old years. Walking into the long hallway and watching the light from the windows fall across the tile, I understood this was the first time I was not running from my family and not letting my family pull me. I was standing in my place, in the white coat, inside the noise of machines and hurried footsteps, and for the first time I saw I was no longer the child begging to be accepted. I was someone deciding for myself how I stayed and how I left. That afternoon I returned to the room with the chart in my hand and saw all three of them gathered around the bed. My father was propped higher on the pillow than yesterday. My mother sat close on his left, and my brother stood with his arms crossed near the window. No one spoke when I entered, but their eyes all fixed on me, as if they were waiting for an answer they had already prepared. I set the chart on the small table beside the bed and checked the heart rhythm again, then adjusted the bed height so he could breathe easier. My mother spoke first and said he was better now and he wanted to talk to me. I nodded but kept writing. My brother gave a thin laugh and said, "Finally, the family gets to sit together like this." I did not react. I only asked everyone to keep their voices down because there were other patients nearby. My father looked at me and said he did not want me standing here only as a doctor. He wanted to talk as father and daughter. I paused my pen and looked at him for a second and said, right now I was on shift. My brother cut in and said I always used work to avoid the family. I turned to him and said I was doing my job. My mother held my father's hand and said she only wanted me to come home for a while so he could feel at ease. I straightened and said I was not going home. The room went silent for a few seconds, and then my brother laughed and said, "I always thought I was above everyone because I wore a white coat." I did not laugh back. I asked if he came to visit a patient or to start a fight. He stepped forward and said, "I left when the family needed me most." I set the chart down and looked straight at him and said I saved our father with my own hands, and that was the only thing I needed to do here. He shook his head and said I did not understand what family meant. I turned back to the bed and adjusted the blanket and told my father to practice steady breathing. My father took my hand and said he did not blame me anymore, and he only wanted me close. I gently pulled my hand away and said he needed to rest. My brother slammed his hand against the window frame and said, "I was cold like a stranger." My mother started crying and said, "Both of you, stop fighting." I looked at her and said, "I did not come here to argue. I came to work." My brother stepped closer and said I should drop that attitude because I was still a child in this house. I said I was a doctor in this hospital. The tension in the room grew so sharp, a nurse walking by even stopped to look in. I told my brother to lower his voice, and he said I was afraid other people would find out about the family. I turned to the nurse and said everything was fine. then looked back at him and said if he kept shouting I would have him removed. He sneered and asked when I learned to throw relatives out. I walked to the door and opened it and told him to come out to the hallway if he wanted to keep talking. He stood still for a few seconds and then followed me out. In the hallway, he said I was making the family lose face. I looked straight at him and said, "The family lost me a long time ago. Not today." He froze, and then said I liked talking as if I was the victim. I said I did not need pity, and I did not need anyone pulling me back to a place I no longer belonged. He asked if I still considered our parents family. I said they were the people who gave birth to me, but they were no longer where I returned to. He pointed at me and called me selfish. I said I was only protecting my life. He said if I was not coming home, then I should not step into the room again. I looked at him and said I would keep being the doctor for that patient until my shift ended. No more and no less. He turned away a few steps, then turned back and said I had changed so much he did not recognize me. I did not deny it, and I did not explain. I went back into the room and saw my father looking toward the door. I adjusted the IV line and told him he needed rest. He asked if I was angry at the family. I said I was not angry. I just was not going back. My mother stood and said she did not understand why I was so hard. I looked at her and said I had stood alone for too long to go back to being someone who needed protection. My brother returned to the room and said I always thought I was strong, but I was really just running. I said I was not running. I was here, in front of everyone, inside my work, he said. Then he would leave and let me live alone with that choice. I did not stop him. I only turned to my father and told him to focus on recovery. The room went quiet again, and there was only the steady sound of the machines. My mother sat down and wiped her tears. My father closed his eyes. I wrote a few more lines in the chart and walked to the door. Before leaving, I said I would come back to check again, and I asked everyone to keep it quiet. No one called me back. I walked down the long hallway and felt my steps grow steadier. In my head, I could still hear my brother's voice and my mother's crying, but I did not feel shaky the way I used to. I stopped at the staff room door and took a deep breath and opened it. Inside, the lights were bright and the internal phone kept ringing. I sat at the desk and kept working like any other day. In that moment, I understood my family still wanted to pull me back into the old place. But I had stepped onto another side of life. I was no longer someone who needed permission to leave. And I was no longer someone who had to return to be accepted. I chose to stay with myself and with the work I built day by day in silence. And for the first time, when I thought about walking out of that room, I did not feel like I was abandoning anyone. I felt like I was moving forward. I was standing in the staff room and had not even sat down when the door burst open so hard it hit the wall. My brother rushed in with his face flushed red and his eyes full of anger. He spoke so loudly that several nurses in the hallway turned to look. He asked how I dared to abandon the family like that, why I refused to come home to take care of our father, and instead stood here like a stranger. I did not answer immediately. I closed the chart in my hand and looked straight at him. I said I was working, and if he wanted to talk, he needed to lower his voice, but he did not listen. He stepped closer and pointed at me, saying I was selfish, that I traded the whole family for the title of doctor. I saw patients in the waiting area looking over with irritation. A security guard had already started moving closer. I took a deep breath and told him this was a hospital, not our house, and if he kept making a scene, I would call security. He let out a bitter laugh and said I truly was an outsider. His voice grew louder and mixed with a resentment I had known for a long time. I did not want to argue, so I turned and opened the door and stepped into the hallway. He followed and kept saying things that made people stop and stare. An older nurse stepped forward and told him to keep it down. He brushed her hand away and said, "This was family business." In that moment, I could clearly see people growing uncomfortable. Security stepped in and asked him to leave. He struggled and said I had humiliated him in front of everyone. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life I saw him smaller inside his own anger. Not strong, but lost. Security asked him to leave again, and this time their voices were firmer. He was escorted away under the eyes of patients waiting to be seen. My mother ran out from the room, but only caught a glimpse of his back as he was led toward the door. She called his name, but he did not turn around. I stood there and did not follow. Inside me there was a strange feeling, both heavy and hollow. I went back into the staff room and sat down. My hands trembled slightly, but I reopened the medical chart. The heart monitor next door beeped steadily. I knew I could not let an argument pull me away from my work. I went to check on an elderly patient struggling to breathe. I held her hand and told her to take a deep breath. She looked at me and asked what was happening out there with all the noise. I just smiled and said it was nothing. She nodded and said being a doctor must be exhausting. That simple sentence made my eyes burn. But I did not let any tears fall. I continued my shift as if nothing had happened, writing notes, listening to hearts and lungs, answering nurses' questions, until the clock neared midnight. The hospital grew quieter. I stepped into the hallway and saw my mother sitting alone on a long bench. She asked where my brother was. I said he had already left. She sighed and said nothing more. I went back into the room and looked at my father sleeping, his face more peaceful than earlier. I pulled the blanket up and stepped out. In my mind, I saw the image of my brother being escorted out of the hospital under so many eyes. I felt no satisfaction and no sadness, only that it was the natural result of someone who did not know when to stop. I understood he did not lose the family because of me, but because of the way he faced everything with anger. I walked outside and stood before the glass, looking down at the empty parking lot. The night wind was cold and cleared my head. I thought about the path I chose and saw clearly it had no room for being dragged back by blame. I returned to the staff room and finished the final report of my shift, each line appearing on the screen like proof that life continues even when someone is left behind. Before leaving the hospital, I passed the entrance where my brother had been escorted out earlier. Now there were only lights and a few dry leaves. No raised voices. I slowed my steps for a moment and then kept walking. Inside me there was an emptiness but also a lightness I did not need to explain to anyone. Because some endings do not need tears or apologies, only silence, so each person can carry their own part forward. If you have read this far and have ever felt pulled between your family and your own life, you can leave a comment and share your story. If this story touched you, then give me a like so I know you are still here. And if you want to follow Lena's journey next, do not forget to follow so we can keep going together.